Carla, there's lots of other questions, but I think what we might do is we might save them for the panel because, some of these things will undoubtedly come up when we talk about, the way forward, and especially engendering consistency. So if you'd care to bring in the engendering consistency in the panel session, that would be awesome. So Kylie, thanks a lot for the talk. What we're going to do now is we're going to move straight on to the panel session, and I'm just going to share my screen because I had just to give you an idea of what the sort of questions are going to be that we're going to talk about. Once I work out how to do it, full screen for me, share screen. Right, so this is, the whole session has been called The Future of HRECs in Australia. Both Charlotte and Kylie have given us a really great expose of what happens in the UK and what Bellbury do as essentially a professional ethics committee service. And so to take this a bit further, I thought we'd just deal with a few other topics, some of which could be contentious, some which might not be. The first one certainly is, of course, talking about HRECs in general. And we've had a few talks over the past few days about inclusion and subcommittees, etc. But I think this will extend that to consider the topic of whether HRECs are inclusive enough or whether they are paternalistic, tokenistic, or patronizing. Now, please don't take offense at the language. It's just polemic, it's just to stimulate a bit of conversation and does reflect to some extent some of our panel members. Question 2, is there enough support for HRECs in Australia? Charlotte has mentioned that, and while, I think we should just in some ways take some of that UK model and adopt it. And question 3, moving forward, how do we see the best way to move forward? So what I want to do is then introduce our panel. And of course, we have Kylie here, who is still there. First on the list, we have Professor Cindy Shannon. And thank you, Cindy, for I gather you've just joined us. Got to get my screen up right here. Cindy is the PVC Indigenous Research at Griffith University. Sorry, I should say Professor Cindy Shannon, AM, is the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Indigenous Research at Griffith University. She's is an Indigenous woman, a member of the Ngugi people from Moreton Bay. But more importantly, Cindy has been involved with Indigenous research ever since I started at the NHMRC in 2007, and probably way before that. Eminently qualified to talk about inclusion, probably ethics committees as well, but I think just will give a great perspective. So welcome, Cindy. Secondly, we have Hudson Burden, Dr. Hudson Burden. Hudson is the chair of the Townsville Ethics Committee, Hospital and Health Service Ethics Committee. And of course, Hudson and I talk regularly about ethics. We don't always agree about things, but that's the nature of ethics. And I think it's really useful to have Hudson as a chair of an ethics committee on this panel as well. Next, we have Michael James, Dr. Michael James, who is a physician, or was a physician, potentially retired, but not certain. Michael is also one of the chair people of one of the Bellbury committees. So welcome, Michael, to the, as Paul Kelly would say, welcome stranger to the show. But let's not get into Paul Kelly right now. So Charlotte, I see you're online. Feel free to join in if you wish. You're more than welcome to. Yep, there we go. Charlotte's joining.
I may well do, yeah. Thank you.
Charlotte's joining the panel as well. Well, let's just say the more the merrier. So look, I think we'll just go back to those questions. I'm just going to share them. I can't actually see you all on screen, but nevertheless, let's just do it anyway. Hopefully I can see people. Give me 1 second. Yes, there's everyone. Okay, so I thought we'd just talk about the future of ethics committees and start the ball rolling with the question of whether are ethics committees inclusive enough, or are they paternalistic, tokenistic, or patronizing? Now, I don't just want to leave it as such an open question. I have got some sub-questions there, because otherwise I just hand straight to Cindy and then it'll be 4 o'clock before you know it. So I don't want to do that, Cindy. So maybe we'll start with Cindy though. But Cindy, in terms of the first question, do you think that the use of lived experience, including First Nations people, is considered sufficiently by ethics committees?
Thanks, Gordon, and I promise I wouldn't have talked for an hour anyway. But look, it's an interesting question, and the lived experience part is an interesting one, because I think a lot of assumptions are made in that. And I just want to go back to the question first, and then I'll come back to the lived experience. Are they paternalistic, tokenistic, or patronising? Having been on NHMRC when the original national statement was went through, I was there from 2005 to 2012. I can honestly say it was a giant leap forward then in terms of what was committed to in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research and ethical processes. I don't think we've got it right, and I think if you look at the term paternalistic, it implies authority that is exerted, that restricts the freedom of others, and a subordinate type relationship. And we all know the paternalistic policies that had such a profound impact on Indigenous peoples in Australia during that era of administration and protection and separation and so on. But some of the words in the national statement, I think, are applied very inconsistently across ethics processes, and I think the lived experience of an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person is assumed to be sufficient voice to give to an application sometimes, and sometimes that's appropriate. I think other times you could say the lived experience of a cancer sufferer or of any type of lived experience for which we know there is research is really important. Is it tokenistic? It can be. I've seen it done in that way, but I think it's also very high risk the way we do it now. And I think I've seen it sit outside of good ethical debate. And I think there's been times when, because an Indigenous person has reviewed an application, it may be deemed to be not able to be challenged, or not able to, or requiring just endorsement without that debate. So I've seen a full range of approaches taken, and I think at times it can be paternalistic, it can be tokenistic, and it can be patronising if done really well. And we've got robust processes where there's everybody on ethics committees is taking accountability for the discussion and the debate, and not just those who are deemed to be to have had the lived experience to be the voice of whether this should be approved or not. Then we get better outcomes, I think. So I'll pause for a minute. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Sorry, I was just getting myself off mute because I was not particularly competent in this. So maybe I'll just throw to Michael or Hudson and reflect. Michael, firstly, as a chair of Bilberry, that you, as Kylie's pointed out, you do 80% of the CTNs, therefore 20% of non-CTNs. I'm not sure what the proportion of other applications you review are, but I'm interested in, and Hudson similarly, on the number of appropriate people you have in your committee to deal with those with chronic conditions or lived experience or research involving First Nations person. I know, Hudson, you have one or more on your committee. Perhaps, Michael, you could go first and just give us your experiences of how you deal with situations where you may have to review applications of this nature.
Thanks, Gordon. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. First of all, I just need to make it clear who I'm speaking on behalf of, and it's myself. As Kylie said, neither myself nor any committee members are employees of Bilberry. And while some people might have a quizzical view of there's 10 Bilberry committees, it sounds like a block. But we are separate committees. We have separate experiences and backgrounds. And so I can really only speak for myself. I can't even speak for the committee that I chair. So with regard to...
Noted, Michael, thank you.
It's quite a disclaimer, isn't it? With regard to your question, I actually haven't thought about it all that much. We do mainly commercially sponsored clinical drug trials. Now, in terms of people with the lived experience being involved, they should be involved in the design of the study. That's where they, so that the study is appropriate for their group. But what we get are commercially sponsored, multinational, often drug trials. And so I suppose where I might consider whether I'm paternalistic or not would be for the participants in the trial. And by paternalistic, Gordon, I'm not sure what you mean, but I presume you mean that I think I know better. I think I know best. I know what's good for you.
Pretty much, yep.
Yep. And I have had a bit of a wake-up call about this. We do a lot of first in human cancer studies, and the typical participant, patient who is considering becoming a participant, has run out of all options. They have advanced cancer, they've failed first-line therapy, they've failed second-line therapy, they have no options, and they're offered one of these first-in-human drug trials. And the aim of these trials is to determine safety. And I and most committee members that I've met always consider that this is a very vulnerable group. Why on earth would they go into a trial where there's little chance, or sorry, not little, but the chances of success are not great. And because they are out of options, we're always afraid that they'll be manipulated and they won't fully understand what they're getting into. And it's our job to look after them and protect them and make sure they're not exploited. Well, I was at an early phase cancer meeting just before COVID set in, about, must have been 2000. And there was a presentation about a study on this, and it reset my thinking. And it showed, a study in America showed that 99% of the participants understood the study as research. They knew that safety testing was the goal. They did actually comprehend that they had a very low chance of benefiting. And yet they had this feeling that they might win the lottery. It's the chance of winning the health lottery. The other reason given commonly was altruism. I suppose I'd become so cynical that I couldn't believe that that was still around. And and so the speaker said, you're looking at these people as a vulnerable group who won't understand what they're getting into, who don't understand the information sheet, and you're wrong. This was a wake-up call for me. It was a real kick in the pants wake-up, actually. And that there is no way that I, or even the other members around the table, online now, could put ourselves in the place of a person who's got advanced cancer, failed all therapies, and they're offered this trial. So it stayed with me, and I'll keep it in my mind. The other thing that if myself or other committees, other chairs were drifting down a path of what you might call extremism in the way they viewed certain people or certain submissions. As Kylie said, we come together, all the chairs come together every 3 months, and we discuss this stuff. And that collegiality and trust actually keeps us fairly level. It's not hard to find a chair colleague who puts you straight on something and argues for their position. So it's a very good process that evens out the tendencies to extreme. And I just mentioned something else. What I was talking about just then is people, respect for persons or autonomy. Autonomy used to be in the original national statement, it's disappeared, but respect for autonomy is allowing people to decide for themselves when they'll go into a study or not. And that's the example I gave was for first-in-human cancer trials and people out of options. I had a meeting just this last Wednesday, and we rejected a first-in-human drug submission out of hand. We simply rejected it. And so here, we're certainly not respecting autonomy. We're actually overriding that, and we are being paternalistic, I suppose, in saying we will not even let you have a chance to volunteer for this study. We think it fails in the terms of merit, research merit. So here we're not respecting autonomy, if you wanted to put it in that way, and we are being paternalistic if you wanted to put it in those terms. However, it was easy to justify in terms of the national statement and research merit.
Yeah.
And they've knocked it on the head. So there are some examples of the things that I come across with the drug trials.
Yeah, wonderful example, and a great segue for you, Hudson, in terms of your consideration of applications, how you use those lived experience members of your committee, and as Michael has just pointed out, the situation under which you might just say, well, you know what, we're not even getting to that respect for autonomy stage because it doesn't even reach research merit.
Well, that is the crux of the issue and the point at which we come to. If something doesn't reach research merit, that is the end of it. And I don't see that as us being paternalistic. I see that as us exercising the safeguards that we are here to exercise. We have a disparate committee. We have lots of different areas of expertise and also lay members on our committee. And I'm trying to think of an issue where we didn't reach consensus, and I can't think of one. So across all of those areas, we have been able to reach consensus, easily so. We have reached out to other people with expertise, particularly the First Nations wing of our hospital and health system, which is growing in importance and which we're using ever more as, I would say, a consultant. And that helps us on too. The thing that puzzles me going forward is the fact that we're one committee, and as we just saw in the UK, there are a small number of committees.
64.
We have what, 250 here in Australia?
195 at last count, I think, Hudson.
Okay, so we've lost a few. And so I'm not sure that number might not be too big, but how would that number be diminished? Geography, specialty, politics?
I think we can. Might ask Charlotte that one in a second, but well, let's ask Charlotte right now. So Charlotte, you know, so in our system we have 50 odd the committees certified by whose ethical review processes are certified by the NHMRC. Now that's not quality of research. That's the administrative support, of which Kylie, I think you have 12 of them possibly. Yep. Townsville is one. Royal Brisbane is one, Prince Charles, at least in Queensland, I'm only talking about. I'm fairly sure Royal Adelaide Hospital, etc. Charlotte, how do you, we did sort of briefly talk about how to get about reducing them, but you know, do you think it has made your system better? How have you dealt with the issues such as those studies that require input from people who have the condition for which the research is being designed?
Yeah, I was really interested to hear about the inclusion of people with lived experience in the design of the trial, because it's something we're grappling with in the UK. So the ethics committee, when reviewing the application, will look at how people have been involved in the design of the study and the production of the materials. And sometimes it's done brilliantly. And as Cindy said, sometimes there's some really bad practice or tokenistic ways of doing it, or they've run the participant information sheet past the secretary in the hospital. But our ethics committees struggle with actually what can they do. It might have been that it's often too late in the day. By the time it comes to the ethics committee, the protocol could have been in preparation for a couple of years. The researchers have been given a big funding grant, and the ethics committees are worried about, if I issue an unfavourable opinion, that means this going to delay this research, which is an important piece of research. And so they are stuck. And whereas we've been encouraging researchers to do it, the encouragement doesn't seem to have been enough. One thing we're looking at doing when we update the clinical trials legislation in the UK is putting it in legislation that there must have been public involvement or users with lived experience involved in the design of the study. What our standard will be around that, I don't know. It's a huge problem we're grappling with. So I was really interested to hear.
Well, okay, so let's take that point forward. So Kylie or Cindy, so as I understand it, well, of course, we have a national statement, and the national statement, while not a Bible, is very good guidance. It gives us a great sort of basis on which to use our common sense, objectivity, and experience. but putting things in legislation sort of seems to be a hammer to crack a walnut. So I'm, you know, that's my terminology. So, so Cindy or Kylie, what do you think of that? I mean, having it in guidance or having it in HMRC funding requirements is a shed load different from having it in legislation. So feel free, Kylie or Cindy, to answer that one. What do you reckon?
I'm happy to jump in, but Cindy, you know, sure, yell out. I mean, I suppose, to be honest, the analogy that I come back to is other areas of diversity. I mean, even gender and other features of diversity where we spent decades not really getting anywhere. You know, we might be better than we were, but still a long ways from where we should be. And of course, we see that in Australia even more in terms of inclusion of First Nations people. And so while I accept it's a significant step to embed it in research, to embed it in legislation, I think you probably do get to a point, this is a personal view, you do get to a point where if you really want change, you have to make it happen. And I think for us, I mean, we're anticipating that there will be more and more requirement to you know, demonstrate, you know, we know that it is effective and we know that it should be supported. Our question really is around, so how do we actually make it happen? And I think from a Bellberry perspective, I think there's actually a couple of things I would say. As Michael had said, we're really thinking about how do we make sure that there's lived experience in the design of research and in the preparation of materials that support the research process in a way that is respectful and comfortable and comforting to participants. And so that's really not so much about the review, that's actually about how do we make it happen in the research design. From a review perspective, actually, one of the things that I would like to really, I suppose, put on the table and emphasize is that, of course, in our national statement, as with lots of other jurisdictions around the world, we have to have our community members on our committees as well. Of course, we've talked a lot today about skill sets and expertise and science and science and clinical expertise, but our community members, our pastoral care members, our legal members are also really important members of the committee, and you know, they're defined by what they're not rather than what they are. But their lived experience in community, you know, they're intended to provide a more community view on research. And our community members do an absolutely wonderful job. Michael, I'm sure, can, you know, can share stories too. They're an incredible bunch of human beings that do, you know, some really incredible work and provide really incredibly valuable input into the development of the review processes, the review of materials, particularly the review of participant-facing materials, but not solely. They also provide a really good conscience call around some of the scientific dimensions of trials as well.
Thank you, Kylie. So Cindy, do you think, I mean, you have a lot of experience in Indigenous research and you have been in the NHMRC for a long time, in terms of, and as you say, where it was a giant leap from where we were, but do you feel it's moving quickly enough, or do you feel that legislation is an appropriate lever to get where we need to be? Just on mute, Cindy.
Sorry, I don't know how many times I've done that. But I'm probably not the only one. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, to be honest. But what I will say is that we do need a lot more clarity around what the guide currently suggests for Indigenous health research review. Firstly, I don't think we're really clear about what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research is. I mean, it's very easy if it's research that is explicitly in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health, it then gets pushed into that bucket. But you know, I don't know how many applications I've seen that are in prisons or in hospital settings where we have very high prevalence of Indigenous people, you know, affected, where people tick the box no, and there's either an ethical issue there in itself about why, or it doesn't get subjected to the same review because the population in prisons or wherever, I'm just using that as an example.
It's a fair point.
It
Absolutely.
hasn't considered the real overrepresentation. So the issue of the lived experience in design, for me, I don't believe that a lot of research, even now that gets approved in Aboriginal communities, has necessarily got that level of experience in the design. It might conceptually have experience in what the research is trying to do, but I've seen a lot of still people signing letters of support, or people being asked, do you think this research would be a good idea, or I want to do some work in your community. So that lived experience in design, I think, needs a lot more clarity if we're talking about it, and I fully support that. You know, people are loosely using the language of co-design everywhere now. And it's been around Aboriginal communities for a long time. We co-design everything because that's what the ethics requires us to do. Similarly, in the review process, I mean, the statement says it has to include assessment or advice by people who have networks with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples or knowledge of research, or people familiar with culture and practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That is not necessarily the lived experience.
Mm.
So, you know, and it doesn't actually mention lived experience. It doesn't actually mention that you have to be Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. So that gets interpreted in many different ways and applied in many different ways. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think that we need a lot more clarity about whether, one, we really want a separate chapter for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or whether really fundamentally it's about research ethics. That's controversial, I know, and what would be appropriate for any subgroup within the population that has particular cultural or particular health or other issues.
Thank you, Cindy. Well, let's move on slightly. Let's ask a question about the quality of research and
I think Hudson wants to.
Sorry, Hudson. My apologies, Hudson. Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
I was just wondering if now would be a good time to introduce the concept of data sovereignty into the discussion.
I wasn't planning to, but feel free to go ahead.
Well, it's not just including people, but having the people who are the subjects of the research own that research, design the research, and carry it out. And particularly in First Nations research, that's where we should be going. There's plenty of literature now, there's plenty of scholarship, there's plenty of activity that's steered in that direction, but it hasn't taken hold amongst all researchers. And we're using that as a yardstick when we look at First Nations research.
I mean, Hudson, we have
letters of support from this or that Aboriginal group is one thing, but having the people who are the subjects of the research have a real stake in designing it, ideally developing it in the first instance, is a powerful concept, and I think one that we need to steer more towards.
We have the HRECs guidelines, we have the NHMRC guidelines for ethical conduct and research involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. You know, these bring out the principles of respect, reciprocity, and data sovereignty. Do you not think that if we're not embedding them, that then the HRECs are the gatekeepers of really what gets passed and not, and irrespective of whether you have researchers in co-design, do you not think the buck stops with ethics committees to approve or not approve?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I think that's what we're here to discuss.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so actually it's a good segue actually. So if we talk about are our HRECs the best place to judge the quality of the research? Do we need subcommittees, lived experience, First Nations subcommittees to judge the quality of research, or should this be left to the ethics committee to decide? Michael, you're sitting there patiently and quietly, so I'm going to throw that one to you.
There we go. Regarding First Nations research, I don't see any, so I won't comment on that. With regard to quality of research, Bilberry tailors each meeting according to what protocols are coming in. So last Wednesday, and this has been helped a lot by having virtual meetings. So we can have somebody coming in for an expert for a primary review and then leaving. And I think it looks after the reviewers, and it makes for a very rich meeting with the right reviews. So last Wednesday, we had the core group, which was there for the whole meeting, and that included also a research physician, pharmacologist, some others. And then the first two submissions, we had a toxicologist, a specialist phase 1 reviewer, and a clinical pharmacologist. They left. Then we had a person coming in as a specialty to review a surgical device. They left. Then we had a dermatologist for the 4th one. They left. Then we had a neurologist for the 5th one, bearing in mind that the core group is going right through this. And that core group included a lot of people who could also be secondary reviewers. And that's how it works at Bilberry, and it works in a way that I never experienced when I was chair of the Royal Adelaide's Ethics Committee. It was a bit of a compromise. You had to get the reviewers that you could. But here, I think Bilberry's, the processes of putting together these individually tailored compositions for the meetings really does contribute to the quality of review. And as a chair, the one thing I think all chairs need to do at the end of the night or day is to be satisfied that a submission had a good review. And if you're not, then you need to pull back and hold it over or something like that. And generally, I'm satisfied that it's had a good review.
Thank you. Charlotte, the UK is a very multicultural country. How do you ensure that, in the same way, do you have various subcommittees that can provide the required advice? Do you seek external experts? How do you manage that assessment of research quality by the correct, I guess, the correct group?
Yeah, we do seek expert advice if the committee, when they review the application, decide that they would like to go to external expert advice. We do that. One of the issues that sometimes we grapple with is an application can be poor quality, but is unlikely to do any harm. So we have this with some of the student research, for example, where the committee think, well, it's not great, but it's not going to harm anyone. So, and it's not unethical. So we sometimes have that issue where the science versus the ethics can be a bit of a hot topic amongst the committee members. So that's kind of one thing that that does come up sometimes. Oh, this application is poor quality, but it's not going to do any harm. It's going to be beneficial for the researcher, a good experience for them getting involved in research. You know, it's a minimal risk study. We'll approve it, but we don't particularly like the design. But then also that's quite different to quite large clinical trials where the quality actually is much more important, and bad quality has greater repercussions for the participants. So in those, if there's something about the science that the ethics committee are struggling with, yeah, we do go out for external expert advice.
Thank you, Charlotte. I just want to move on slightly tangentially, and this is one for Cindy.
Kylie has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kylie. I'm not looking at. I'm just thinking. Sorry, Kylie.
That's okay, Gordon. And I just wanted to add explicitly, and I guess join the dot. I can see there's a question in the Q&A about scrutiny by community members, and I just wanted to kind of add. You know, Michael's kind of covered this, but I just want to make it really explicit. I know that in lots of, and I know Bilberry runs a really quite a different model to a lot of the institutional committees. We don't run scientific subcommittees. We have the whole national statement defined committee around the table reviewing the whole of science and the ethics. So all of our community members, pastoral care, legal, are all present for the whole of the discussion. As Michael said, we actually move the science and clinical expertise. We point to the committee according to the expertise required for the study, and those folks might move in and out depending on what the appropriate expertise is for the meeting. But the community members are in the meeting for the whole time. And the other aspect of our model that is quite different to others is that we take the responsibility on our side to train our committees to conduct a consistent review. So in our case, we actually don't require any kind of recut of an application form. We actually provide the core research documentation to the members. So the research protocol, the IB, the participant information and consent form package, and anything else that's required. And so that all of that goes to the community members as well as the scientific members. And so to the question about that scrutiny by all members, that's built into the model that we provide. But I do think, joining the dot with another question there about payment for members, it reinforces really one of the reasons why we think it's actually important to remunerate members, because it is a very significant role, very significant responsibility, and it's a significant time commitment.
Thank you, Kylie. And yeah, look, I think we heard yesterday, and thank you, Fran, for your comment. Fran was speaking yesterday in part of the value of lived experience. So my apologies, the layperson session. So I think Fran made some good points yesterday, including the need for remuneration of lay members, and I kind of also think it's respectful to provide remuneration to HREC members as well. So thank you for that. Just want to move on. Cindy, so one for you, and then I guess we'll go to Hudson after that. In terms of there are a specialist Aboriginal HRECs, so the New South Wales Health and Medical Research Council, South Australian, I think Health and Medical Research Council, Queensland doesn't have one, but they potentially, it could be the first port of call for an application for research involving First Nations people. Firstly, do you believe that that is the appropriate way forward? Should they be going to a peak body like IATSIS, or in Queensland Quake, or one of the First Nations ethics committees before moving on?
Oh, that's a very, very controversial question, Gordon. Look, I've had the experience of doing a lot of health service reviews, commission work in New South Wales, so I'm very familiar with the AHREC. I don't think that many Queensland Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal researchers would see that as an appropriate mechanism for them, and I don't personally believe HMRC would either. I've also been involved in discussions over many years at Quake, probably that initiated over 20 years ago, when they were looking at setting up an ethics committee. And I think there's this desire amongst peak Aboriginal organisations to have a community-controlled ethics committee without an understanding necessarily of what the administration of ethics and governance of ethics requires. So it's one of the first things people learn when they learn about cultural competence. I'm not a great fan of some of that training, but is the diversity that exists across Australia. So if we're going to do anything, and thinking about 195 ethics committees across the country, and there are a couple of peak bodies that are very particular to a community or a political affiliation, I think it has to be a national one with good representation and good arms into expertise, because we don't have, I don't believe, the supply of reviewers for 195 committees across the country that can do it justice. That's my own personal view.
And Cindy, you and I were probably both involved during national mutual acceptance and the determination or otherwise to establish a First Nations committee, and that went nowhere quickly because it was just too difficult to get sufficient representation. And it does speak to the need to get that to the community consultation in reference to the specific community, and maybe that is really the way forward.
Can I just make one last comment if I can, because I think that it's Aboriginal health research that gets labelled as high risk. And the reason I think it's in one of those risk groups is because of the consequences if something goes really pear-shaped. But a lot of Aboriginal research should be treated in the same way as other research if the methodology is right, if the consultation's been right, if the considerations around particular populations, whether it's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or people with a disability, or have adequately been addressed. And to think that, you know, I'm an Aboriginal person, I've had a lot of experience in ethics, but to think that I can be the one of two people who influences an outcome. There are many times I actually wanted to take things to a table and debate them because I don't have the answers and I need the expert in a particular area to help me. And I think we end up in situations where, because an Aboriginal person's reviewed it with the greatest respect, that it either gets, yes, that one's approved, or if it's overturned, there's an outcry and there might well be a reason for it. So it's a middle ground we've got to find.
That's a great, we've got a very good segue coming up, Cindy, but I will say that I think we talked about the fact that a view is just a view, irrespective of whom the view comes from. And if one is influenced by one view, I firmly believe that should be challenged. But it does lead to the next kind of question or segue, which is, if an application is then approved by a committee, and I'm going to hand this to Hudson, but another committee decides not to approve it, where do we go there?
Well, this is where we wish there was an ultimate arbiter, particularly in First Nations research, but also in other research, because we are in the midst of a dilemma where we have denied what we consider the worst application we've ever seen. We're conscious that other ethics committees have approved it, and there's no avenue to resolve that. And I see that as a big problem that really needs a solution.
Interesting. Kylie.
Can I just, sorry to interrupt, but if I could just say, absolutely, totally agree, Hudson. I've been in a position where I've challenged decisions that should never have been made and were made, and research that should never have happened, and I've had nothing to protect me, or to get a higher level view or some sort of other review, as you say.
Okay, Cindy, taking that slightly further though, let's say that application had been approved, was one of First Nation research, and had been approved by an Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council, and then not approved by another non-First Nations committee. Does that change your view?
No, I've seen research that's been reviewed by, and with all respect, by Indigenous people, and I can't disclose without breaching some issues. So the nature of some of the research that's been approved, it first and foremost, you've got to be legally compliant, and then that actually wasn't compliant. And I think anybody, it wouldn't matter who reviewed it, you can't do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Michael or Kylie, have you come across that situation where you have had discordant views from another ethics committee? Also, Kylie, I might just turn that one around because, and the reason I'll turn it around is, of course, Bellbury, although being certified by the NHMRC and part of NMA, did have for some time issues with other people accepting their reviews. But either Michael or Kylie, would you care to put your views on that to the audience?
Yeah, sure, Gordon. When I was at the Royal Adelaide, and we would push back on an application, we didn't like it, we were going to reject it. It was very common to get the response that this has already been approved by another ethics committee, which of course doesn't change your mind. If you've gone through it and done a thorough review and you've decided this doesn't have research merit, that comment, another committee has approved it, just doesn't wash. And I suppose it's a reminder, I think you used similar wording, Gordon, committees provide opinions. we provide opinions. And when you look at the mandated structure of an ethics committee, it's not surprising that there is diversity. But that experience as a standalone ethics committee at the Royal Adelaide is different from what I'm experiencing at Bilberry, where we still get the same thing. We'll get pushback and we'll differ from other committees. One big difference is every 3 months, as Kylie said, we come together formally and we have a meeting of all the chairs in the presence of the executive. And we can sort out differences between us in a very collegial manner. And it's collegial because we kind of know each other, we respect each other, we're all professionals, we have different backgrounds, we acknowledge that. If that could be achieved at a state level, for example, where all ethics committees had a process where they could come together periodically and just talk about stuff, it would go a long way to breaking down the intensity that people feel about some ethics committee having a different opinion from theirs. So what I can say from my Bilberry experience is it works. It works. Getting 10 chairs together to talk about things simply works. And the differences might persist, but they just kind of fade into the background. They're not as intense as they were. If that could be achieved at a state level, which could be a case study for a national level, I can tell you it works. And when I was at the Royal Adelaide, I used to go to National Ethics Committee meetings and talk to other chairs. And all we talk about was, we're not well supported, we need more resources. And that was it. There was no other topic of conversation.
Yeah.
And really, we all knew we were in the same boat, and it felt like a lifeboat.
So and Kylie, I'm going to come to you, Kylie, but I'm going to sort of change the topic because I want to talk about sort of standardization and how you've achieved that. But I will say, Michael, I mean, you have essentially at Bilberry a community of practice of 12. And I was talking with Ian Tyndall the other day about getting our Queensland HREC chairs, because I understand South Australian chairs have a meeting as well. So it does sound like starting to join some dots would be appropriate. And you can achieve standardization, Kylie, through your 3-line whip, as it were, and your meeting of 12 chairs and deputy chairs. But you have the means by which to achieve that. You are a professional organization. Short of what Michael is suggesting in terms of having some leadership from somewhere, is it possible for other HRECs to achieve the same level of standardization, competence, what are the words that I have, non-professionalized entities to achieve the same level as you have, do you think?
That's such a good question. And I have to say, when we're thinking about excellence in HRECs, when we're discussing this matter with government stakeholders, with regulatory stakeholders, we, I suppose, advocate for other HRECs. We know through personal experience what resources we think it takes to really support an HREC. We can put a number to it because it's what we do every year, and we feel very conscious of the luxury and the privilege that we have to do that, and based on the fact that we're an independent entity and we're setting our own budgets. It seems to me that health systems, and we know that the Australian health system at the moment is very focused on embedding research into clinical practice. If that is the case, then it seems to me that the health system actually needs to appropriately resource that research within the system, and that includes the appropriate review and oversight capability.
That's a wonderful answer. Hudson, obviously Townsville has Teresa up there. So I guess my question to you is, as a chair of a hospital HREC, do you feel that Townsville Hospital and Health Service does wish to embed research into clinical practice, does it resource it to the extent that it needs to?
It's heading in that direction. The moves are all afoot. As chair of the HREC, I feel well supported, well resourced, and well integrated with the research establishment, the research community, the research effort of the hospital. So I'm very positive about what an HREC can do and the resources available. I've also been heavily involved in one HREC in New South Wales, and I felt that way in that committee too. So we're talking about improvements and problems, and I have to say, from my perspective, there's a lot to be said for benefits of what we have now.
Yeah, and so, but the general question, there are eight HRECs in New Zealand, there are 64 in England, there are 200 in Australia. Can we achieve that sort of? We have the national statement. Can we, or should we achieve a high level of standardization? I guess what I'm saying is, should there always be some sort of subjectivity to it? Are we trying to achieve slavish standardization or only in certain aspects? I'm not sure of the answer, and I hope they've framed the question appropriately. Cindy, I'll just throw this one to you, actually. Given we have so many HRECs in Australia, do you think we can actually achieve a standardized approach to particularly anything?
I'm happy to answer that, but I did note that Kylie had her hand up, Gordon.
Keep missing it again, Kylie. You've taken your hand down, that's why I've missed it.
Because I was interested to hear Cindy's answer, but I just wanted to touch on this issue of when we get differences of opinion. I think, as Michael said, when we look at the nature of an HREC, they're intended to create a diversity of an opinion. So it seems to me when we talk about differences, we should be really conscious about, are we talking about what is the nature of the difference of opinion? And we've talked a little bit about how do we resolve differences within the Bellberry communities, but of course, we do have the situation where there might be of a difference of opinion, not necessarily even between a Bellberry committee and a public Australian committee, but so many of our protocols that we see are international, multi-jurisdictional clinical trials. So more often it's actually a difference between an REC or an IRB in another country versus Australia. And in those cases, very often the difference is actually logical, rational, perfectly reasonable. Classic example would be where the Australian HREC requires a change to a standard of care comparator because we have a national health system that applies a standard of care requirement. That's a difference, but I would say to you that it's a good difference. We can understand it. It's perfectly rational. It's perfectly supportable. And that's a good thing. As opposed to if there's a difference because actually we have a fundamental safety concern, we've seen a gap in the preclinical, well, that should be a difference of opinion that we are concerned about. And those kind of cases, we should be saying, how do we come together? How do we support each other? And I know within Bellberry, Michael, I'm sure will recognize this, we have discussions, for example, about, do we reject a study or do we withdraw a study? Now, Bellberry rejects studies, and quite often the nuance between do we reject or do we provide feedback is actually often about, do we see significant safety concerns with this protocol that actually require a rejection? Because we don't want to leave the possibility of a withdrawal and then that study ending up somewhere else with an HREC where it is not disclosed that there were safety concerns. How do we get better about working with each other so that together we can provide an additional safety net to participants? That, it seems to me, is a bit of a weakness in the system at the moment. And if forums like this can build on actually us working together to resolve those things, I think that would be really helpful. The third element of difference I see, and I note this is in the comments as well, the more likely scenario that we might see is where an ethics committee has approved, but then there's a local governance change of opinion. Now, even that, I'm going to actually push you to say, sometimes that's very frustrating and sometimes it might be, unreasonable. But actually, sometimes it might be, again, because of that localization issue, it might be perfectly possible to say this protocol is acceptable, but it's difficult to run in this particular facility for some reason or another. And again, where those are the genuine reasons behind the differences, we should actually support that.
Yeah, I totally agree, Kylie. I think we want to know that there's a very good reason for doing it, but we don't want frivolous reasons. It has to be, based on safety or local legislation or regulations. Now, Cindy, we've got 5 minutes left, so you don't actually have to answer this question. That question. What I might just do is, given we have such a short time, we might just move very quickly on to the future and the best way forward, or the most appropriate way forward. I mean, we've talked about consistency, we've talked about discordance and decisions, we've talked about inclusiveness. Maybe I'll just allow everyone to have a couple of points, perhaps, on what they see the key way forward to, I guess, try and engender that consistency, or to minimize distinct, large differences. So, Michael, I might start with you because you're being nice and patient again. What do you see as if you had your crystal ball and your magic wand, what would you do?
I don't have much extra to add that I haven't already said. It's about committees speaking to each other. Your desire to decrease the number of ethics committees in Australia, you'd have to say, what's the goal? Is it to get more consistency, and would that happen? Or can it be done as it stands? I think just reducing the number as a standalone statement, as a standalone goal, doesn't seem quite good enough to me. What are the reasons for wanting to do that? And partly one of the reasons might be to make them more sustainable. In the hospital setting, it's hard, well, it was hard for me to recruit clinicians because hospitals only care about ambulance ramping at the moment. Clinicians are time poor, they do not have the time. And I noticed with Charlotte's presentation, she was there's 64 HRECs, and she was talking about the membership and the recruitment. And she said, and I was quite impressed with the way they were pulling in specialists. And then she did say it's becoming challenging to recruit new members with the pressure in the National Health Service. And I thought, well, that's it, isn't it? So how do you get around that? And I think you just need to look after members. And with Belbury, my description of my meeting last Wednesday, allowing specialist members to join, leave. So they weren't there for the whole meeting, but the whole meeting was actually richer for their presence, is very useful. And looking after members is one of the ways forward. And I think all of the hospital HRECs are going to come under pressure in recruiting clinician members because they're time poor, because they're getting hammered.
Yeah. Okay, Cindy, your final thoughts on what would you like to see out of ethics committees to, not necessarily just in First Nation research, but in general, how do we make the system better to your mind?
I think that there's a definite need for more consistency, and I will talk specifically about First Peoples because I've been engaged with a few recently, and the approaches to how Indigenous review takes place are so different with the ones I've spoken to. And the reality is, if we want a high quality review, we've got a limited supply of people who understand the science and the quality issues, but we've got a vast network of people with lived experience, and they're used in different ways by ethics committees. The other thing I would just say, there's some emerging language that needs to be demystified at ethics committee level, and I think it's Indigenous leadership at the national level that's really needed to bring this together. There's things like, as has been said, data sovereignty, but people use loosely Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous methodologies and terminology that gets interpreted in different ways and does at times spook people a bit into believing that, oh, that's all encapsulated in this research, so that's fine. And I don't actually think we've got a consistent narrative around those things. So I'll stop there.
Oh gosh, that's some big points.
Sorry, it's Friday afternoon.
No, it's Friday afternoon, and you just need a gin and tonic, as we all do. Hudson, over to you.
Well, I agree with Cindy about the need for consistency. As I said before, we achieve consensus and we seem to do it easily across the hospital, a goal towards enhancing research, building the research capacity, ethics committee being a part of that. I wish we could have that nationwide and an arbiter for situations where one ethics committee sees something as being execrable and another one sees it as being totally approvable. Other than that, I think the system works quite well. It certainly does for us. And I don't know if we have a magic mix of people. We even get clinicians on our committee fairly reasonably or fairly easily. So
you're just in a laid back part of the world there, Hudson, up in Townsville, or you in Byron Bay, that is. Kylie, well, I'll have the last word, but Kylie, you may have the last word from the panel.
Thanks, Gordon. It seems like I've been this way a little bit today, but I might be the contrarian again. I'm not always sure about driving for the same. So if I think about schools, for example, you want a good school for your kids. You don't necessarily want them all to be exactly the same because children are all the same. And so similarly, I wonder if we overly concern ourselves about making all ethics committees look the same. I think if you ask researchers, what they want is they want frequent application dates, they want frequent meetings, they want fast turnaround, they want consistency. And they're not necessarily fussed about all of that looking the same as long as it works effectively. And so for me, I guess in response to that question about reduction, yeah, it is important to ask, why would we do reduction? But one reason we might is by saying, as one of the other panelists says, if we want high quality research, we need to make sure that we've got high quality review and oversight. And so realistically, reduction might be about focusing our resources in a smaller number of HRECs that are really delivering excellence. That's not about reducing the kind of the well-resourced, the well-supported, the thoughtful HRECs we've been talking about. It's actually about addressing those where they're an afterthought within an institution. The challenge, and I've already spoken about one, I think there's an opportunity for helping each other. That's about adding to a system that already works well, but acknowledging that we are, a disparate group of HRECs across the country. How can we support each other? And the final challenge I'd leave everybody with, I think, is, we've talked about the challenge of current skill sets, but if we look at future therapies, we're looking at, we've been in a paradigm where there's very clear lines between medicines, biologicals, and drugs and devices, and much clearer lines about, clinical expertise to review those. We're heading into an area where there will be blurred lines, both in terms of the technologies and in terms of the use case. And so we might not even be talking about recruiting one member, we might be talking about recruiting several to provide an appropriate review of what currently takes.
Additional complexity.
Absolutely.
But I really take Michael's point about getting, external members in for one thing, other external members for another. I really like that because it brings in external expertise, but also has a flexible approach. I'm afraid we have to stop there. Clearly, we could go on forever. There was lots more questions. There were lots more questions, but it was always the first topic was always going to take more more time than the rest. I salute the combined wisdom and expertise of the panel. It's for those that stayed online, thank you very much. I think you've been treated to, some great sort of thought leadership in this area. There are way too many topics that we could have talked about, but I think the future of HRECs and how we, I guess, get the best out of them is really, it's a really important topic. Be that in first people's research or other conditions, it doesn't really matter. I think the principles are the same, and I do take the point about reducing committees. I mean, one other reason, Kylie, might be that many committees don't actually review very many applications, and as you say about resourcing, that might be the reason for that. So I know I was talking with Colin Thompson about that. 13 years ago or something like that. So yeah, nothing's changed, I guess. So please thank the panel, Kylie, Cindy, Michael, Hudson, and Charlotte, who had to leave because her laptop was running out. And thank you all very much.